when a retired seamstress from rural Tennessee walked into the most prestigious fashion design competition in the country, carrying a dress she'd sewn by hand on a 40-year-old Singer machine. Nobody in that room believed she belonged there. Not the photographers angling for shots of the real contenders. Not the corporate sponsors adjusting their lanyards near the registration desk. And certainly not Cecilia Voss, CEO of Voss Collective, the fastest-growing luxury fashion house in North America, who looked at the woman and her garment bag and said something to the man beside her that made them both laugh. The woman with the garment bag was Irene Blakely. She was 51 years old, 5'3", and she had driven 11 hours from a town outside Cookeville in a 2003 Civic with a cracked dashboard and a passenger seat permanently reclined because the lever had broken sometime around 2019. She hadn't fixed it because her granddaughter Poppy liked to ride that way, legs up, watching the trees blur past the window. The cracked dashboard and the broken seat were features now, not flaws. That was how Irene thought about most things. The competition was the American Artisan Design Summit, held every 2 years at the Merchandise Mart in Chicago. It was the kind of event that made careers and ended them, where buyers from department store chains walked the floor with tablets and intent expressions, where design school graduates networked in clusters near the bar, and where the innovation category, the one Irene had entered, was typically dominated by people with MFAs and studio budgets and teams of pattern assistants. Irene had a sewing machine, a kitchen table, and 43 years of doing this by hand because she loved it. The security guard at the competitor entrance did a visible double take when she presented her registration packet. He studied the laminated badge, then the garment bag, then her face, as if expecting her to laugh and admit she was lost. Artisan innovation category, he said. That's right. He looked at the garment bag again. It was plain canvas, the kind you got at a fabric store for $8, with her name written on the tag in permanent marker. You're exhibiting a garment. I am. He stepped aside, slowly, like a man who had decided he wasn't paid enough to ask follow-up questions. The exhibition floor was the size of several city blocks under one roof. Irene had been to trade shows before, smaller ones, regional craft fairs where she sold quilts and alterations, and occasionally a custom piece for a bride who'd heard about her through a cousin. This was different. The lighting alone probably cost more than her car. Each exhibitor's station was lit like a museum installation, the garments displayed on architectural mannequins, the signage printed on materials she didn't have words for. Corporate teams moved between stations making adjustments, checking angles, consulting with photographers. Somewhere near the front of the hall, a television crew was filming an introduction segment for a streaming series about the fashion industry. Irene found her assigned station, number 47, in the back corner near the emergency exit, and began setting up. She had one mannequin, borrowed from a friend who ran a bridal shop back home, one folding table, a small printed sign she'd made at the library on cardstock, and the dress. The dress was the reason she was here. She had started it 2 years ago, the week after her husband Roy died of a heart attack while fixing the gutters on their house. She hadn't planned to make something extraordinary. She'd planned to make something to keep her hands busy while her mind refused to go quiet, while the house felt too large and too still, while Poppy asked questions she didn't know how to answer. She'd pulled out her best fabric. Silk charmeuse in a deep green she'd been saving for something she couldn't name, and she'd started cutting. What came out of 300 hours of work over 18 months was a garment that looked like something between an heirloom and an invention. The construction was classical, French seams, hand-rolled hems, boning she'd shaped herself, but the surface embellishment was entirely her own. She had developed a technique over decades of working with thread and fabric that allowed her to create dimensional texture without added bulk, a method of stitching that caught light differently at different angles, so the dress seemed to shift color as the wearer moved. She had never seen it done exactly this way in any book or magazine or online tutorial because she had arrived at it through trial and error and 40 years of watching how fabric behaved. She hadn't known it was innovative until her granddaughter's art teacher, a woman who had studied textile arts in graduate school, saw the dress hanging on the back of the bedroom door and stood in the hallway for a long moment without saying anything. Then she turned to Irene and said quietly that she had never seen anything like it. The art teacher was the one who found the competition listing. She was the one who helped Irene fill out the application. She was the one who drove to Cookeville and sat at Irene's kitchen table for 4 hours, making sure every field was completed correctly and every photograph was properly formatted. Irene had told her it was a long shot. The art teacher had said that long shots were still shots. The dress was on the mannequin now, positioned carefully so the light from the overhead fixture caught the surface embellishment at the angle that showed it best. Irene stepped back and looked at it the way she always did when she finished something. Not with pride exactly, but with a kind of quiet recognition. Roy had loved this color. He'd said it looked like deep water in late afternoon. She'd told him that was a strange thing to say about a dress. He'd said he was a strange man, and she'd agreed, and they'd both laughed in the kitchen with the windows open, and it had been one of those ordinary moments that only feel significant when you look back at them. She was still standing there, not quite seeing the dress anymore, when she became aware of someone watching her. Cecilia Voss was not a woman who went unnoticed in rooms. She was 42, with the kind of composed, angular beauty that looked like it had been maintained through discipline rather than luck. She dressed the way people dressed when they understood that clothing was communication, a wool blazer in a shade of ivory that existed at some precise expensive distance from white trousers with a break that required a specific heel, jewelry that cost money in the way that only other people who spent money on jewelry could immediately recognize. She moved through the exhibition floor the way people moved when they were used to being watched, which was to say she moved as though she wasn't thinking about it at all. She had stopped approximately 6 feet from Irene's station and was looking at the dress. Not the way people glanced at things in passing, actually looking. Irene watched her look. After a moment, Cecilia's gaze shifted to Irene, and something in her expression sharpened. Not unkindness exactly, but the particular focus of someone who had spent decades cataloging what belonged in certain rooms and what didn't. "This is a competition entry," Cecilia said. It wasn't quite a question. "It is the Artisan Innovation category, yes." Cecilia's eyes moved back to the dress, and then to the borrowed mannequin, and then to the cardstock sign, and then to Irene's station in its entirety, the folding table, the garment bag on the chair, the complete absence of corporate presence. "Did you make this yourself?" "I did. Where did you train?" Irene considered the question. "I didn't, formally. I learned from my mother, and she learned from hers, and I've been doing it long enough that I figured some things out on my own." Cecilia looked at her for a moment. Then she said, with the careful pleasantness of someone being deliberately kind to a person they expect will be embarrassed, "That's lovely. Really, the craftsmanship is evident. But I should tell you, and I'm saying this to save you some difficulty, the innovation category judges are looking for technical advancement in the industry context. This is a beautiful garment, but what you're describing sounds more like traditional technique. There are other categories that might be more appropriate." "I entered the right category," Irene said. Something shifted slightly in Cecilia's expression. "I'm sure you believe that." A man appeared at Cecilia's shoulder, tall 50s, with the careful grooming of someone who attended a lot of professional events. He looked at the dress, then at Irene, then at Cecilia, with an expression that telegraphed amusement. "The submission from Tennessee," he said, in a way that made it clear he'd seen the registration materials. Cecilia smiled, and it was not the kind of smile that invited participation. She turned away with a small nod toward Irene that contained, in its precise degree of inclination, everything she thought about the situation. The man followed. Irene heard the word charming as they moved toward the next station. She turned back to the dress and straightened the hem where the mannequin's foot had pushed it slightly off-center. The judging panel for the innovation category met participants for 15 minutes each in a private consultation room off the main floor. Irene was scheduled at 2 in the afternoon. She spent the morning walking the exhibition floor, looking at what the other entrants had brought. The competition was real. She understood that immediately and without resentment. The other pieces in the innovation category were technically sophisticated, a bonded fabric system developed by a team out of Boston, with funding from a sportswear manufacturer, a modular construction concept from a Los Angeles studio that had been featured in 3 industry publications, a draping method developed by a recent Parsons graduate that used computational modeling to achieve structural effects. These were people who had resources, mentors, institutional support. These were people who spoke the language of the industry fluently. Irene had a Singer machine and a kitchen table. She bought a cup of coffee from a cart near the entrance and sat on a bench by the windows and watched Chicago go by outside and thought about Roy. He would have found this funny in the specific way he found most things funny, not dismissively, but with a kind of delighted recognition that the world was strange and human and worth paying attention to. He would have looked at the man who said the submission from Tennessee and figured out exactly what the man wanted from life within about 4 minutes, and then told Irene later, quietly, without meanness, because Roy had never been mean in his life. She missed him the way she'd been missing him for 2 years. Not constantly, but in sudden drops, like stepping off a curb you didn't see coming. Poppy had told her, the morning Irene left for Chicago, that Grandpa would have been excited. Irene had said probably so. Poppy had said she was sure of it. She was 9 and spoke with the certainty of someone who understood exactly how things worked. The consultation room held a table and 5 chairs. 3 judges were already seated when Irene was shown in at 2-7. 2 women and a man, each with tablets and printed materials. The materials included photographs she'd submitted with her application. The lead judge was a woman named Dr. Patricia Hollingsworth, a textile engineering professor at FIT who had served on this panel for 12 years. The other 2 judges were a materials innovation specialist from a fabric manufacturer and a buyer for a major retail chain who had spent 30 years in the industry. They looked up when Irene entered, and she watched the same sequence of micro-expressions she'd been watching all day. Recognition of who she was, comparison against expectation, recalibration. Mrs. Blakely, Dr. Hollingsworth said, "Please have a seat. We've reviewed your application materials. Can you tell us about the technique you've described as dimensional surface variation?" Irene told them. She talked for 11 minutes, and she knew she was talking for 11 minutes because she could see the clock on the wall, and she'd been told she had 15. She described the specific stitch geometry she'd developed, the way she'd discovered that varying needle angle in combination with thread tension at specific intervals created a surface behavior that wasn't achievable through standard embroidery or weaving methods. She described the 43 years of working with fabric that had led to the particular combination of observations from which the technique emerged. She described what it looked like in different lighting conditions and why mechanically it behaved the way it did. The material specialist stopped her 3 times to ask questions. Each time, the questions got more specific. By the 3rd question, she had her phone out, pulling up a paper she'd apparently read that morning, and she looked at Irene with an expression that had traveled some distance from where it started. "You haven't published anything about this technique?" the specialist asked. "I didn't know you could publish something about a technique," Irene said honestly. "Has anyone else examined the garment technically? Measured the stitch geometry, analyzed the thread behavior?" An art teacher named Mrs. Delaney. She has a master's in textile arts. She told me she hadn't seen it before. The buyer, who had been quiet, leaned forward. "Where did you get the silk?" "A supplier out of New York I've been ordering from for about 15 years. I bought more than I needed because I was afraid to run out and not be able to match it." "How much fabric did you work through developing the technique?" "More than I can really account for. It developed over a long time. I have notes somewhere, but it wasn't like I sat down one day and invented it. I just kept working until the fabric did what I wanted." Dr. Hollingsworth made a note on her tablet. "Ms. Blakely, we're going to need to examine the actual garment more closely before we can make a determination. Can you bring it in this afternoon for closer inspection?" "Of course. I want to be transparent with you," Dr. Hollingsworth said, and her voice had changed, become more careful. "What you're describing, if it holds up to technical examination, would be a genuinely novel contribution. I don't want to raise expectations prematurely, but I also want you to know that we're taking this seriously." Irene walked back to her station thinking about Roy again. She didn't know why. Maybe because he'd always been the one she told things to first. The technical examination happened in a room on the 3rd floor with equipment Irene had never seen before. A digital microscope connected to a monitor, lighting rigs that could be adjusted to isolate specific wavelengths, a textile analyst who ran a magnified scan of the stitch structure and stood back from the monitor for a long time without saying anything. "You did this freehand?" the analyst said. "Yes, every stitch, every one." He looked at the monitor, then at Irene, then back at the monitor. "How long did this dress take you? The embellishment work specifically?" "About 200 hours. He was quiet for a moment. "I've been analyzing textile construction for 20 years, he said. "I've never seen anyone achieve this level of consistency in freehand surface work. The geometry is as precise as machine work, but the variation is organic. I don't know how you did this. I've had a lot of practice. That's not." He stopped. "That's not really sufficient as an explanation, but I'll let the judges sort that out." She was escorted back to the main floor. At her station, she found that a small group had gathered. 3 people looking at the dress with the careful attention of people who had heard something and come to see for themselves. One of them was the Boston team's lead designer, who nodded at Irene with an expression she couldn't read. And then Cecilia Voss was there again. She was standing at the edge of the small crowd, and she was looking at the dress differently than she had that morning. This time she wasn't cataloging its context. She was looking at the dress itself. Irene watched her look. After a moment, Cecilia turned to her. Can I ask you something? Go ahead, the surface variation. Is it structural or decorative? Both, Irene said. It changes the hand of the fabric, too. The texture affects how it falls. Cecilia looked back at the dress. Show me. Irene moved the fabric with her hand, tilting the mannequin slightly so the light caught the surface at a different angle. The dress changed the way she'd told the judges it would. The green deepening in some areas, lifting in others, the whole garment seeming to breathe. Cecilia was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the floor noise continued, conversations, footsteps, the distant sound of someone testing a microphone, but it felt separate from them somehow, like they were standing in a pocket of stillness. I came over this morning to be kind, Cecilia said finally. I want you to know that. I understood that. I was wrong to be condescending about it. Irene didn't confirm or deny this. Where did you learn to do this? Cecilia asked. I told you. I didn't. Formally. That's not possible. But she said it without force, like someone working through something rather than making a statement. My husband used to say the most useful things were the ones nobody taught you, Irene said, because then they were actually yours. Cecilia looked at her. He sounds like a smart man. He was. He died 2 years ago. A pause. Something moved in Cecilia's expression, quickly then gone. I'm sorry. Thank you. They stood in silence for a moment, which should have been awkward and wasn't. I'm going to tell you something, Cecilia said, and I'm telling you because I think you should know, not because I'm trying to help myself. This technique, if it's what it appears to be, is going to be valuable in ways you probably haven't thought about. There are going to be people in this building today who want to acquire it, not license it. Acquire it. Do you understand the difference? I think so. If you don't already have an attorney, you need one before today is over. Don't sign anything. Don't shake any hands that feel like agreements. Irene looked at her. Why are you telling me this? Cecilia's jaw tightened slightly. Because I've spent 20 years building a company on innovation, and somewhere in the last decade I stopped asking whether the innovation was ours or whether we'd just been better at acquiring it than someone else. She stopped. I don't want to be the person who acquires yours. The results were announced in the main auditorium at 6 o'clock. Every exhibitor was invited, along with the buyers and media and industry observers who had been on the floor all day. Irene sat in the third row with her borrowed mannequin back in its garment bag at her feet and her cardstock sign folded in her coat pocket. Poppy had called at 5:30. Irene had answered, standing in the lobby near a window, and they'd talked for 10 minutes about nothing. School, what Poppy had made for lunch, whether the hotel had a pool. At the end, Poppy said, Grandpa would be watching if he could, you know. Irene said she knew. I think he'd be real loud about it, Poppy said. Embarrassing loud. Irene laughed. He would have been the loudest person in the room. Tell him hi if you feel him there. Irene said she would, and she did, standing by the window while Chicago went dark outside. Just a quiet word she offered to the general air, because Roy had always said you couldn't be sure what reached where, so you might as well act as if everything did. Dr. Hollingsworth came to the podium at 6:04 and spoke for a few minutes about the quality of the entries before reading the names. The innovation category first-place winner was Irene Blakely, for the development of an original surface embellishment technique representing a novel contribution to textile construction methodology. The room was quiet for a moment, not the good kind of quiet, the processing kind, and then the applause started. It was uneven. The way applause was when people were still figuring out what they thought. The Boston team clapped. The Parsons graduate clapped with what looked like genuine sincerity. Several of the buyers clapped with the focused enthusiasm of people who had already started thinking about applications. Irene walked to the podium. Dr. Hollingsworth shook her hand and said quietly that the panel had been unanimous. She gave Irene the award, a plaque and an envelope containing, she was told, a check for $15,000, and stepped aside. Standing at the podium, looking out at a room full of people who had spent most of the day not knowing her name, Irene thought about the Singer machine in the spare bedroom. She thought about the kitchen table with the ironing pad permanently set up on one end. She thought about Roy at the window, watching her work, telling her the light was better in the morning and she should move the machine. She thought about the night she'd started the green dress, sitting alone in that house, needing something her hands could do while her mind wouldn't cooperate. She didn't have a prepared statement. She hadn't thought she'd need one. My husband died while I was making the dress that won today, she said. I started it the week after the funeral because I needed something to hold on to. I've been sewing for 43 years, and this technique came out of all of them. Every mistake I made, every piece of fabric I ruined, every time I pulled out stitches and started over. I didn't invent it so much as discover it, the way you discover something that was always there if you stayed at the table long enough. She paused. I want to say something to anyone who came here today carrying something they made by hand, without a team or a budget or a studio, and wasn't sure if it was worth bringing. It is. Stay at the table. The applause this time was different. She found Cecilia Voss in the lobby afterward, standing slightly apart from the congratulatory crowd that had gathered around Irene with cards and introductions and carefully worded interest. Congratulations, Cecilia said. She said it simply, without the corporate gloss, and Irene believed her. Thank you for the warning this morning, Irene said. About the attorneys, did you find one? I called one. She's available tomorrow morning. Good. Cecilia was quiet for a moment. I'd like to talk to you, eventually, about what we might do together. Not tonight, not until you have proper representation in place. But I want you to know that the conversation I want to have isn't about acquisition. It's about partnership. Irene looked at her. What's the difference in your experience? Acquisition is when I take something that's yours and it becomes mine. Partnership is when we figure out together what it can become. She paused. I've done more of the first than I should have. I'm trying to do more of the second. Why tell me that? Cecilia seemed to consider this carefully. Because you asked an honest question and you deserve an honest answer. They stood for a moment in the lobby noise, conversations, congratulations, the particular energy of a room recalibrating around a result it hadn't expected. My husband had a theory, Irene said. He said people told you the truth about themselves in the first 10 minutes if you were paying attention. He said most people just weren't paying attention. Was he right? Usually. Cecilia nodded, and something in her settled, like a decision made. Call me when your attorney is ready. I'll have documents prepared for her to review, and we'll sit down and have a real conversation. She extended her hand. You made something extraordinary. It deserves to be in the world. Irene shook her hand. Everything I make deserves to be in the world. That's why I make it. Cecilia smiled, a real one, the kind that changed her whole face, and walked away. The drive back to Tennessee took 11.5 hours because Irene stopped twice, once for gas and once because she needed coffee, and also because she wanted to sit in a diner outside Indianapolis and eat a piece of pie and not talk to anyone for 20 minutes. She sat in a booth by the window and ate cherry pie and watched a light rain work its way across the parking lot. She thought about the $15,000 check in her bag. She thought about the attorney she was meeting tomorrow morning. She thought about the exhibition floor and the borrowed mannequin and the cardstock sign and the way Cecilia Voss had looked at the dress. She thought about Roy. She tried to think about what came next, but kept running into the fact that she didn't know yet, and that was okay. She had lived with not knowing for 2 years. She had gotten fairly good at taking the next step without being able to see the one after it. Poppy was asleep when Irene got home at 2 a.m. Her daughter-in-law had left the porch light on and a plate of food in the refrigerator with a note that said congratulations, and we watched the live stream, and Poppy screamed when they said your name. Irene stood in her kitchen, which was the same kitchen it had always been, with the ironing pad on the end of the table and the Singer machine visible through the doorway of the spare room, and she felt the full weight of the past 2 years settle around her, not crushingly, but the way heavy things settled when you finally put them down somewhere safe. She poured a glass of water and stood at the window. The yard was dark. The same oak Roy had hung a tire swing from when their son was 7 still at the edge of the grass. Too big to cut down, too important to cut down. I won, she said to the general air quietly, because Roy had always said you couldn't be sure. In the spare room, the Singer machine sat on its table, thread still through the needle from the last piece she'd worked on before leaving. A half-finished alteration for a neighbor's wedding dress, nothing significant, just work, just her hands knowing what to do. She went to bed at 2:30 and slept better than she had in months. And in the morning, she called the attorney and then called Cecilia Voss and started figuring out what came next, one step at a time, the same way she'd been doing it since Roy died, not because she could see where it was going, but because staying at the table was the only thing she knew for certain.